Hey everybody. What I want to do is go over the solution for the Acme products and categories where we're going to be interacting with a database. Now, I was actually able to set this up. It wasn't even a couple of steps, but I was actually able to set this up on Heroku, which is nice. So able to deploy it, which was kind of nice. It's something that I'll show you folks a little bit later on, so you could actually start thinking about deploying the projects that you're creating. But right now, our functionality is that we can go from a home page to what I would say is a category page. A little bit different now in terms of the fact that we're going to it based upon an ID instead of a name because we're using a database. We could delete products. We could delete a category. We could add a category. When we add a category, we go to that category page and we can add products. So fairly simplistic CRUD, and not really total CRUD because there's editing that we're not doing, which is fine for this point. I mean, I think if you're able to insert and you're able to delete, you could always end up adding editing. So what I wanted to do here is just think about what we're trying to accomplish. So a good part of these projects is, where do I get started? And that's one other reason why I do sort of like the idea of doing some test-driven development, because I think it sort of leads you down a path of where you could start. So, for instance, what I want to do here is something that I did in a similar way to the last project, which is to build out our model class. And our model class is going to have a number of different methods. We're going to want to be able to get our categories. That's probably the first thing that we'll test. We want to be able to get our categories. We want to be able to create a category. We want to be able to delete a category. And when it comes to products, products are underneath categories. So we want to get products by ID, which would be the category ID. We also want to be able to create a product where we pass in a category ID and the name of the product. And we also want to delete a product. And in this case, unlike our other example, we could do that by just passing in the ID. The only other thing that I needed to add here was this getCategory method, because before in our other example where our categories were simply just really strings or keys to our object, here our categories are rows in the database. So if we want to get the name of a category instead of passing, if we want to work with a category instead of working with a name, we're going to work with an ID. And if we want to get the name of a category, we're going to want to get it with the ID. So let's start out by figuring out where to start out. And right now I've got let me get back to something where I was before. So let me go up one level, and I'm going to go to, and this is my TDD version. And if I look over here, I have nothing in it. So what I want to be able to do is to do something like this. npm test to run things, which I can't really do. So let's actually add my, do an npm init. Now, I know at this point there's going to be two things that I need right off the bat to do my testing. I know I'm going to need Mocha. I know I'm going to need Chai. And I'm going to save them as a dev setting. And it'll go out and it'll get Mocha and Chai. I also know that there's one other thing that I need, which is going to be my Postgres library, which is going to allow me to connect to Postgres. And this is not a dev dependency, so I'm going to save that as well. At this point, if I was to, let me close down some stuff that I had before. In this case, if I was to go and take a look at this, I would see that I've got my package.json with some dependencies. And what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to jump the gun just a little bit by specifying that when I do start my test, I'm going to start it with a connection variable. And I'll say Postgres And this is going to be localhost, and this is going to be acme test db. I think that's what I ended up calling it. So that's going to be my connection variable. I'm not actually going to need a port to do my testing, but once I go in here, I'm going to say nodemon. And again, just jumping the gun, I know that I'm going to need to look for, at some point, I'm going to want to test my views as well. So I do want to be on the lookout for changes to not just JS, but HTML. And here I'm going to end up going into my node modules folder, mocha, bin, mocha. So that should be enough to actually go back over here and say npm test. Okay? And the problem here when you get this message is that it's trying to look for a directory called test, which it doesn't find. And if I go back over here, I can end up creating that directory. And let's go over here and we'll say this is going to be our, let's call it our model spec, and we'll say JS. So this is going to be, we're going to want to test out our database that we're interacting with. So if we were to go over here and say we're going to describe, we're going to say DB, and we'll go over here and we will say that we are going to, what are we going to do with our DB? Let's say that we're just going to start out by saying it exists. So this is going to be our database class that, again, I call it our model, but our database class. And our database class is going to be our entree into anything to do with our database. So this is where we're going to have all those methods, create category, delete category, insert category. I shouldn't say that. Create category, delete category, create product, delete product, get products by ID, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go over here and I'll say expect DB to be okay, that it exists. And of course, this will fail. And it'll fail again because we didn't bring in our expectation library. And this you're probably getting tired of seeing. But this is going to be expect. We want to bring in from the try library the expect function, which is going to now be our expect function. And we get another error that DB is not defined. So we'll say DB equals require ... DB. And as we go through this, we say can't find the module DB. But we'll go back over here and we'll add DB.js. So our tests should end up passing here, but let's actually do a test for something else. Right, so I think our most basic one would be to describe get categories. And so we'll say, hey, look, by default, we'll be even more descriptive with no categories in database. We'll say, what do we expect? We'll say returns an empty array. And so how are we going to run this? Well, obviously this is going to be asynchronous. So before we would have done something like this, we're going to do something similar. But I actually want to bring in promises, which is not going to be a big jump here. Let's returns an empty array. Again, we really have written zero code at this point. What do we really expect? We've done something like this. DB get categories. We pass in a callback function, which is going to give us our categories. And before, we were able to do something like expect categories to equal, not necessarily be the same object, but we're expecting to get back an empty array, and at this point, we're going to be done. So this is what we had done. If we would have done this before, this is how we would have, set this up. And when I say before, I mean prior to sort of looking at promises. Again, in our last example, we didn't really have any issue of callbacks because there was nothing that was asynchronous. We were just pulling data from an object that was in memory. But here, this is closer to what we ended up doing with our tweets. If you remember that solution, we were getting our tweets, and we were testing that stuff out. So now if we go here, it'll say get categories is not a function. We could get a quick win over here by saying module.exports and going down here and saying get categories, and putting in our function for get categories. Again, this is going to get passed in a callback. Now, if I did this and I just said CB, let's say foo, right? It's going to say, hey, look, this is not good. Foo is not equal to an array. So just to get this to pass, we could end up doing this. Now, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but it would be nice if, in fact, we could make this a little bit more promising. Where we don't necessarily have to pass any callback to our get categories, but it would be nice if we could do something like this. Again, it's not going to feel all that different here. I'm going to redo it because sometimes modifying this could be a little bit tricky. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say db get categories. And I'm going to assume that I'm going to write this so it returns a promise. And when this promise is resolved, I'm going to get my categories, in which case I'm going to run my expectation. And I'll say I expect categories to equal an empty array. So what I'm doing here is that instead of having to pass my callback function here, I'm using a promise, and when I'm done, I expect to do that. Now, if we were to go and run that, we get an error. Well, we're getting an error because CB is not a function. That's fine, but let's actually not even call CB. Let's go over here and return nothing. And so now we get a different error, and it says, hey, look, I can't read then of undefined, meaning that what we need to do is return a promise from get categories. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to use the promise library from Bluebird, which is a promise library. And if we go to do that, and I think I might have Bluebird installed globally, so just to be on the safe side, when we go to deploy this, I'm going to install Bluebird, and I'm going to save. Again, this is not for development. This is what we're going to use to create our promises. So what we're going to do here, instead of actually just returning get categories, what I'm going to do is return, and this is going to be new promise. And so what happens with this new promise is that I can pass in a function. This function is going to take a resolve and a reject. So that if you want to create a promise for yourself, you could do it with the Bluebird library. Bluebird will allow you to instantiate a new promise, which we're returning here. And then just to get this to pass, this now has a then that's associated with it, because a promise has a then associated with it. If I go to run this now, what I should find is that that's fine. I did return a promise, but I never resolved the promise. So now what I'm going to do here is that I'm just going to say, hey, look, I'm going to resolve, and I'll resolve an empty array. Okay. Now that works, but it's not really the results that we expect to get. We really expect to interact with our database. So how are we going to go and do that? Well, let's get into this promise type mode. And what we're going to do here is that when we go to get our categories, we're first going to go and connect to our database. So instead of just generating a new promise like this, we're going to want to do something like this. We're going to want to actually have some way of connecting. And we're going to connect. And we're going to, when we connect, we'll get a promise back. And this is not code that we've written. We'll get our connection back. And then once we have our connection back, assume that this is an object that can interact with a database. And we'll go over here, and normally we would just say connect.query, select star from categories. No parameters here, but this is going to either get an error or a result. So once we end up doing this, what we expect to do is, hey, look, say if we have an error, then what we'll do is we'll just say, hey, look, get out of there, return, and we're going to want to find some way of rejecting a promise. So this is going to be a little bit trickier to do. We're going to want to have the ability to create a promise in order to do this. So we'll think about how we can end up sort of drawing this out. But let's assume that we have this connect method that uses promises. And let me actually do one thing here. So what we could do in an event is actually to create another promise. So we'll say return new promise. We'll have a function resolve and reject. Again, promises get chained to return other promises. And in this case, what we could end up doing here is we could say we're going to use our connection. We're going to use it to query. And we're going to select star from categories. This will be an empty parameter here. This will be our callback, error and result. And what we'll do here is if in fact there was an error, what we could do here is we could say if error, we can just get out of here and say, hey, look, we are rejecting things with this error. There was a problem. We're rejecting it with this error. Otherwise, we're going to resolve it with our result.rows. Okay? And the one thing that you always have to do here is that we just have to always make sure that when we're returning a promise, we put in return here. So the only piece that we need to create here is our connect method. And so what we could do here with our connect method, we'll take a look and see what this looks like. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, similar to what we did before, we're going to connect. And what's that going to look like? So one thing that we'll do here is that we don't want to keep on connecting to our database. So one thing we could say is we could say, hey, look, if we have connected before, that's fine. We're just going to basically return that connection. And I'm going to label this a little bit different here. I'm going to say this is my connection promise. And I'm going to say, hey, look, if in fact you have some connection promise, we don't want to connect to the database every time. If you have some connection promise, then what I want you to do is just return your connection promise. And otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing that we ended up doing before, which is to say client equals new PG client. And here we're going to use our process, environment, connection string. And let's just go up here and let's bring in our PG. Again, the promises are just going to give us the ability to sort of flatten things out a little bit. So if we have a connection promise, we will return the connection promise. Otherwise, we are going to actually do the following. We're going to return a new promise. And in fact, before we return it, let's actually say if we don't have a connection promise, our connection promise is going to be a new promise with a resolve and a reject function. And assuming that, we'll move this in here, and assuming that we ended up creating this promise, we will now return this connection promise. So it's important to note that these promises are the promise that something is going to end up happening, right? It's either going to get resolved or rejected, but there's nothing that prevents you from reusing this connection promise, even if it was resolved. So in which case, what we need to do, we need to have some way of going in here and resolving or rejecting. So we're going to tell our client to connect. And if you remember, this will give us an error, right? Or a connection. In which case we can then either resolve or reject this promise. So we'll go over here and we'll say if we have an error, we're going to, and we'll get out of here afterwards, we're going to reject with the error message. Okay? Otherwise, we're going to resolve with the connection. So this promise is going to end up returning us a connection to the database. So again, the big takeaway here is that instead of actually going in and passing any callbacks, we have no callbacks that we're passing in. We're going to return promises, in which case this promise will give us a connection to the database, and this promise will either reject or resolve with the number of rows. And so if we would go to our model spec, right, if this works, we should get our categories. And we've got an error, acme-test-db. That's fine, right? Acme-test-db didn't end up getting called here. One thing you could also do here, you could see that we're also timing out. One of the things we could also do inside of our tests is that we could actually say, hey, look, if in fact anywhere in the chain here we have an error, we'll go over here and this will be our error, and we'll also just call done with the error. So this way it doesn't tell us that we timed out because we didn't really time out, but we had an error, and let's just see what that looks like. So here it just gives us a little bit of a better message. acme-test-db does not exist. And let's see why that's the case. Because it is acme-db test, which I've created. So again, I'm assuming that you've created a database already. So if you remember before, we were sort of hanging on to our connection to see if it existed. Here we're saying, hey, look, if you already have a promise for the database connection, use it. If not, create the new promise. And if we go back over here, Since our package JSON file was what changed, let's kill this and let's run this again. Okay, so I've got an error here, and the error here is, hey, look, you got some data that's in the database. This is a little problematic here. So one thing we spoke about doing last time was this idea of doing a reset. So if we go back to our model spec and we say, hey, look, you know what? Every time that we go through here, let's do it before each. And we'll pass in a function. And we'll say every time that we end up going in here, again, what we're going to do here is we're going to have, say that our database has some method of sort of setting itself back to 0. We'll say db.truncate. The difference here again is that we'll use promises. So we'll say db.truncate, then, assuming it's truncated, we're going to call done. So if we go back here, it tells us we don't have a truncate method. Let's go back to our DB class, and we'll take a look at this again. So we want to have some truncate method here. So we'll create that. Again, if there's a concern that this might get called in a production environment, you could look at your connection string and say, hey, look, if my connection string, doesn't have the word test in it, then I'm not going to truncate. But in order to truncate, what we can do here is, again, we could end up saying connect. This is going to give us a connection string. Excuse me, this is going to give us a connection. And what we'll do here, once we end up having our connection, we could go over here and we could end up returning, again, a new promise, which again gets passed in a resolve and a reject function, which it's our responsibility to call. So now we go here, and we've got our resolve and we've got our reject, and here we're going to run our connection.query. So we're going to wrap around this callback. We're going to query our database, truncate table, and I'm going to start out by truncating the products table, put a semicolon, truncate table categories, no parameters, function. Again, I get back an error, which is going to mean rejection, and I get back a result, which we'll use when we resolve. I don't really have anything to really resolve here, so what I'll do here is, hey, look, if I have an error, then this promise that I returned, I'm going to, and I just, again, like I did with my callbacks, I want to get out of there, and I'm going to reject, and I'll reject with the error. Otherwise, I am going to resolve, and I'm going to resolve. There's really no data that I need to resolve with when I truncate. But if this works, cannot read property then if undefined. So this is a mistake I make a lot, which is that even though I'm creating a promise, I forget to return the promise. So I remember to return the promise within this callback, but I really need to return the promise up here. And there you see that I can return an empty array. And again, we could go out and start to build this up again. So again, just sort of looking at it from how this is working, I think the big one is our connect function. And the way that our connect function works is I say, hey, look, do I have a promise already for connecting to the database? If I do, great, I'm going to use it. If not, I'm going to create it. And I'm going to create it with my promise constructor, which gets a resolve and a reject. I'm going to attempt to connect. If I have an error, I'm going to reject. If I don't have an error, I'm going to resolve with my connection. And I need to make sure, again, whenever you're creating a promise, you need to return the promise. So do you have a promise? Yes, return the promise. You don't have a promise? Create the promise and return the promise. And anywhere that I have promises like truncate or get categories, I've got to make sure that I end up returning a promise. So the big difference here is that it's going to make this code chainable, where if we have some more complex things that we're doing in terms of sort of these sequential operations that we might do, or even things that are not sequential, for instance, when we end up seeding the database, we could end up doing that. We could end up basically making our code look a lot linear and sort of get away from the idea of having nested callbacks. So we'll take a look at another example of this when what we also want to do here, we're going to want to have something like describe with no categories. And here I'll say describe with 2 categories. So again, what I'm going to assume, it returns 2 categories. And how am I going to build that out? Well, I'm going to say the same method, db get categories. Again, I'm not passing in a callback, but I'm getting back a promise. Categories. And I'll go over here, and I'll say expect categories dot length to equal 2. And then I'll call done. And the only other thing that I would do here is I would go over here and just make sure that, again, I have no need to time out here, but if there's an error, I'll call done with the error. And make sure that I pass a done up here. And the only difference here is that if I go and run this, it's going to tell me, hey, look, you expected to have 2, but you only have 0. So let's actually write out how we're going to solve this problem. And really, what we're going to want to do is do a before each. And we're going to have some way to seed our database. Let's just assume that we seed them with 2 categories, a foo and a bar. And so we'll go here and we'll say, hey, look, DB, we want you to seed. And then we're ready to roll for this. And then we'll call done. Of course, this is not going to work, and the reason why it won't work is that we don't have any seed function. So let's actually see how we'll end up creating that. So let's go ahead and we'll create this seed function. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is that we're going to want to obviously have some function called seed. And we know that in order to seed, we're actually going to want to, we could assume that, if we do want to seed, that we're going to want to truncate as well, but we'll actually keep those things separate. What we're going to do here is we're going to write our seed function. So there's 2 categories that we're going to want to create. And so let's just think about how that might look. If we were to go over here, we could do something like db connect. And again, we're just building out our test here, but we're going to, once we connect, we'll get our connection. And once we end up getting our connection, then we could do something like, again, we could write this manually in here, but let's assume that we're going to have some way of actually creating a category. So what we might want to do, and in fact, let's actually even get rid of this connect. Let's assume that we have some method to create category foo. And then we will go and do a then. This will actually give us a category back, or at least the ID for the category that ended up getting created. And we could actually check that out. And once we go over here, we're going to then go and say return create category bar. And in which case, this would be our two categories that ended up getting created. Now, we don't have a create category method, so this doesn't exist at the moment. But again, our big takeaway is that all these things, instead of having any callbacks associated with them, are going to basically be returning promises. So create category is also going to be a promise. And here I'll see create category doesn't exist. But you know, again, the thing that's interesting is as you're writing your test, you'll see that some of the functionality will end up popping out. And again, the other interesting thing is that, you know, we've written a fair amount of code here, but the actual application code that we've written is, you know, somewhere around 60 lines. We probably have a lot more tests than we've written, code that we've written for our tests than our application code. But let's actually create a function to create a category. So here what we'll do is, and again, I make this mistake, it's very common. I need to make sure that I end up returning. Again, you always want to return a promise, especially if you're going to call then after it. You have to. You have no choice. So when I go to create a category, I'm going to say connect. Then I'm going to have my connection. And again, I'm going to use my Bluebird library to, in here, say, hey, look, here's going to be a new promise. And this is going to be a function that's going to take a resolve and a reject object. Notice I'm returning that promise here. And within this, I've got my connection. And I'll say query, insert into categories. And this is going to be name, values, $1. And here I'm going to want the ID. So I'll say returning ID. And then within this, in this case, I'm going to be now using this. I'm going to get passed in a name. And I'm going to want to make sure that when I go to create a category, I'm passing in a name. So the big thing that you see here is you're never passing in any callbacks here. Everything's relying on promises. So I now have my name. And again, I have this function, error, or result. And what am I going to want to do here? So I'll say, look, if there was an error, okay, that's fine. I want to get out of here when I'm done with this, and I want to return, but I really just want to reject with the error. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to resolve, and I'll say result.rows 0 should give me the ID of the category that was created. So if I go to do that, I could go and take a look at this. Cannot read property then of undefined, and again, same error. So if I'm making this, I assume other people might be too. You just have to make sure you return your promise. In which case, it ended up passing. So this is fine. This passes, but let's just tease this up a little bit. First of all, let's just see. Let's do a console.log just to see that we could see that ID. So we could see every time that we end up running this, this is going to get incremented because, again, I'm truncating my databases and incrementing these every time, right? Every time I kill this, run it again, these numbers are going to keep on going up, which is fine. But one thing that you notice here is that I'm running these create categories I'm doing them in a serial way, one after the other, when really what I could end up doing here is actually using something called promise.all. And one of the things that that'll actually give me is that I could actually get these two IDs that are getting sent back just in case I wanted to use them for something. And it's going to come in a little bit handy. So let me show you what I mean here. One of the things you could do with the promise library is to say promise.all and put in an array of promises. And the two promises that I'm going to put in are create category foo, create category bar. I don't care which one happens to get called first, but I just want both of them to end up getting resolved. So, I mean, for whatever reason, this really shouldn't be the case, but if this took a while to run, right, it could be that this ends up finishing first. I don't care. I just want them both resolved so I could have two things in my database before I end up running my test. Now, here, this is going to have no impact on this passing, but what I want to show you here is that if I end up going back to my spec and I went into my seed and I went in here and I put in my promise here, I put in results. What I'm going to end up getting back are these two IDs. This is going to be the ID for foo, and this is going to be the ID for bar. That's just how these things end up getting resolved. If I decided to, just to sort of beat a dead horse a little bit, you know, what I'm doing here is I'm getting away, I'm able to get away from all that nesting here by doing this. And, you know, let's say that I wanted to say foo bar, and I wanted to have another category called buzz. Now, of course, my expectation fails, but you could see that it gives me the ability to get the IDs for all these items that got passed in here, and that might be helpful for me to run some of my other tests, because then I can basically see that I can create a category by seeding, and I could use the IDs to see that I could end up deleting a category. So let's do this. We'll say describe. Let's just modify this. We'll say with 3 categories. And this ends up passing. So now let's add another method for, or another test for getting a category. And so this is where we're going to want to pass an ID for a category. So it gets to be a little bit trickier, because what ID do we end up using to get the categories? Every time we run our tests, we end up, you know, reseeding our database. So let's just say here that when we get a category describe, it gets the category, and we're going to want to do something like this, right? So let's write out our code the way we sort of want it to look. We're going to want to have to say db get category, and we're going to want to put some number in here. I'm just going to throw a number in here that's not really going to work, but this is going to end up getting us back a category. And now we could write an expectation to say expect category dot name to equal foo. Of course, this method doesn't exist, and when we did this, we'd probably want to put a done here. And again, just to make sure our tests don't just time out, we'll put a catch here. This is going to be a possible error that we'll get, which we don't expect to have happen. But what we want to do here is, first of all, we don't have this method get category. And the second thing is, what are we going to want to put in this value? But let's actually see how far we can get here. You know, here we'll see get category doesn't exist. Now let's create this method, get category. And I also just want to point out one other thing that we're going to eventually do to sort of dry things out. Right now you can see in all these methods, we're generating a new promise for for all of these whenever we run a query. So we could actually make a sort of permissified version of query, although we're not going to do that at this point. I just want to point out to you where you see a lot of this new promise here. There might be a better way to deal with this, which we'll investigate. In the meantime, let's go in and write this get category, which is going to get an ID. Again, no callback because this returns a promise. Let me remember here that I'll do this. I need to connect. Then I'll get my connection. And again, I'm generating a new promise here that I'm returning. This takes a function with a resolve and a reject. Again, we'll talk about drawing this out at some point to make our code a little more elegant, a little bit less lines of code. And we'll go over here and we'll say connection.query, and we'll say select star from categories where ID equals $1. And here we're going to pass in our ID. Here we're either going to get an error or a result. And here we actually have where even if we don't end up getting an error, we might not get any results back. So here we'll just say, first of all, if error, return reject with the error, right? We want to get out of there. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we'll actually ask another question. If result.rows.length, meaning do we have any? If we do, we return, we don't return. Well, I could return if I didn't want to do an else here. So we could say return resolve, and this is going to be result.rows. The first row is going to be our category that we're interested in. This is the first time we're not interested in getting a collection of items. We just want to get one item. Otherwise, let's just return. We'll resolve because we don't really need to reject here, but we'll resolve just with a null value, meaning, hey, look, we didn't end up finding the category that you were looking for. And so if we go to run this, what we should find is now that we have a get category, done is not defined, and probably I forgot to, in my spec here, it gets the category. And it says I cannot read the property name of null, meaning that the ID that I passed into it is not accurate, which is not surprising, right? So let's actually do a before each. And we know that we have this ability to seed our database. So outside of this, I'm going to put in foo ID. And when I go in here, I'm going to put in my done. Again, all these things are being done with promises. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, hey, look, db.seed. And this gives me, if you remember, an array of my 3 IDs. So I'm calling it results here. And once I get in here, I'll say foo ID equals results. And this is going to be the first one because that's the first one that I ended up creating in my promise.all. And then I'll call done. And then instead of saying category 3, I'll say foo ID. And that ends up passing. And again, just in case you wanted to look at it. By the way, if I did this, 1, that would be the bar that got inserted. So it would say, hey, look, you expected bar to equal to foo. So you could see that either one of those is giving me this results is a collection of the IDs that are getting inserted. Again, what I mentioned before is that every time you go through here, you could go in here and see these are the IDs. Obviously, you see that they're going up because I keep on, creating records and destroying records. So this, gives us the ability to get a category. Let's just do a little bit of housekeeping here. What I want to do is figure out how we could avoid having to generate these new promises every time. So we'll take a look at doing that, and then we'll take a look at deleting a category, and then what we end up doing for the products is going to be pretty similar to what we ended up doing before. So I want to dry this out a little bit. What I want to have happen here, and this is not something that I need to expose, but what I want to do is I want to have some query function. And what I want to do is pass into that query function is some query and some params. And what I'm going to do is every time that I get into doing this, I want this to return a promise. So I'm going to need my connection object. So I'll go in here again. Even if I have my connection already, it doesn't really matter. It's not like I'm recreating the connection. I'm just returning and using the existing connection. So I'm going to connect. I'm going to get my connection string. And I'm going to return a new promise. And this is going to use the query that I pass in, which is just going to be some text, some params that I pass in, and also, oh, actually, I did that incorrectly. My promise is actually going to pass in, I jumped the gun a little bit, my resolve and my reject functions. So I'm creating a new promise. And I'm going to go over here and I'll say connect, query, params, function, error, result. And here I'll say, hey, look, if you did have an error, get out of there, return, reject with the error. Otherwise, resolve, and we'll just resolve with the result. And what will that give us an ability to do? Again, I'm not necessarily exposing this, and we've sort of written this before, but what that gives me the ability to do is instead of actually going in here and writing my query like this, what I can do, I'm just going to save a little piece of this here, which are the two parameters that I'm passing in. You'll see it's going to save me quite a bit. So I'm going to say return query, and this is going to be my two parameters here. Excuse me, my query, my two parameters are going to be my query and the name that I've passed in. And then I'll have a function here. And now I can end up moving this code over here. If this ends up getting resolved, again, if there's a rejection that's there, the code that called it could end up using the rejection, but it allows me to sort of dry this up quite a bit. Let's actually just see if that worked. So now we're using this internal query method that creates a promise. It ends up getting back a result. Again, I only make it here if in fact I'm successful. And let's just see, we named the query. That looks pretty good. Again, we were able to sort of get rid of the connection because now I'm connecting within that query method. And now we'll see if we still pass. And here we get resolve is not a function. So let's just try to figure out why. Here's a new promise, resolve and reject. Line 46. Oh, so here we're not resolving. So this is kind of an interesting thing. All we're going to do here, we've got a promise already, so we don't have to resolve. All we have to do is return this. We've already got a promise that's happening here. So if this is basically successful, we'll get a result back, which we can then end up returning, which is going to be this, the promise will get resolved with the ID. If in fact there's an error that's here, it'll end up getting rejected with the error. So it really allows us to dry things out a little bit here. And let's just take a look. And that ends up passing. And so what we can do here, once we end up doing that, a lot of this code is going to get a lot nicer here. For instance, when we go to get our category, we could go over here, and I'm going to sort of chop this up a little bit. And sometimes this can be a little bit tricky, but let's see how it turns out. So I'm not going to need this callback. What I'm going to do instead is to say, hey, look, I'm going to return, and I'm going to call this, again, this query method with these values, and I'm going to put a then here. This gives me a result. I'm not worried about the error, because if there's an error, that's going to get rejected, and it'll end up getting handled by the calling code. But what I'm going to do is put in here, and I don't need a resolve and a reject. What I can do is say, if result.rows.length, then return result.rows, because I already have a promise. If not, then return null. So if you weren't able to find a category with that ID, meaning that you don't have any rows that come back, you're going to end up returning null. Otherwise, you're going to end up returning that first row. And let's, again, see whether or not our code passes, which it does. And let's just see what else we can sort of dry out here. So we've got truncate. Again, we could do the same thing here, which is to pull this stuff out. And really what we're going to do when we go to truncate is to specify, instead of recreating this promise all over the place, I could say return query. That's going to be the query. That's going to be the arguments. I don't have any need for a callback, but I am going to have a then, where I am going to get a result. Again, if there's an error, that promise will end up getting rejected, which is fine. Otherwise, I make it back here. It was able to truncate my tables. And my code becomes a lot cleaner here. And let's just see that if that passes, and we'll end up doing it with the last one here. So again, I'm missing a resolve here. This is not resolve. This is just really return. I don't have anything to return. I basically am just saying that I was able to resolve this. And if this isn't the case, and you don't really have anything that you're returning back, you could basically even shorten this out and say, hey, look, when I truncate, just call this query. If there's no errors, let's consider it to be resolved, in which case this will work as well. And we could also just do one more here in our get categories. Again, we could pull this out. We're not going to need this. We're not going to need this. Again, the key is we just want to make sure we return our promise. So once you get into that promise chain, whether or not, once you have that promise, you can chain another promise, or you could just return whatever results you have back in that promise chain. Hopefully that's something you ended up seeing from the workshop. But what this gives us the ability to do is to say then function result, in which case we're going to return. So what I meant by that is that you don't have to put another promise in here. You could just put a return result.rows, and that will in fact pass your data back. And so they all pass. And you can see that right now we've got sort of a minimum amount of code here. Everything's being wrapped really in this query method. Sort of saves us from connecting every time and running the connects query object. That's going to be done internally right in this method, which we don't expose, which is also fine. So that sort of dries things out a lot. I think that helps. Once we do that, we could start taking a look at how can we go about testing out that we can delete a category. One thing we could do here is just we could do our get category again, see that we can in fact get a category, and then just see that we can delete a category, and the next time that we go to get it, we should find out that it's null. So if we want to do that, I'm going to copy and paste a little bit. You don't worry that much about your tests being so dry, but what I'm going to describe here is to delete a category. So if I go to delete a category, I have this expectation that's over here, and what I'm going to do here, instead of calling done right here, I'm going to go and I'm going to say, I'm going to return db delete category, and I'm going to pass in my foo.id. So that should go and that should delete a category. So here I made sure, hey look, I was able to insert the category, and then I call delete a category. And now if I go over here, and now I expect that if I end up attempting to, once that category is deleted, if I now say, hey, look, return db get category using that ID, my expectation is going to be, so if this is the category that I'm getting, the category was already deleted, so I'll say expect category. I'll start out by saying to, let's see, category, let's see if this works, to equal null. I'm not sure if that will work, but let's test it out. I don't know if you could do equality with the null operator. Right now we've got a bigger issue where delete category is not going to work. So we don't have a delete category, but again, the easy part of the code to write is the code itself. So we know how to get a category. Deleting a category is going to be pretty similar. Pass in an ID. Our query is going to be return query, delete from categories where ID is equal to 1. This is going to be our ID. And we're going to say then, there's nothing really to end up getting back here when we delete the category. So we'll just say, hey, look, if we were able to delete it, that's fine. We'll just end up returning that. And let's see if that ends up passing. So delete category is not a function. And the reason why is that we created this method, or I created this method, and we want to just add it here. So it looks like we're timing out. Let's just take a look and see why. If we go back to our spec here, let's see how far down this. I think the reason why that happens is that we have forgotten to call done over here. So once we're done with our promise chain, any expectations that we might have put above it will end up getting called. So let's just see how that works out. And that ends up working, right? We end up getting back, and if we just did a console.log here, console.log category, we'd see when we go delete it, we have null here, but if we ended up doing a console.log category, We'll see that our numbers keep on climbing here as we go up. So here's where we ended up adding it. Here's where we deleted it. Again, the beauty of the promises is that you have the ability to sort of have a very linear structure here. So it deletes a category. Well, first I'm going to seed, so I have a category. I'm going to get the category, so I'm testing out that I can get it, which I actually tested in my other test. I'm going to go and I'm going to delete it. And when I attempt to get it again, I'll find out that, in fact, it's not an exception, but I get null back because there's no category with that ID. So that takes care of our deleting our category. So we really only have two other tests to write. We want to have the ability to get products. So let's see what that's going to look like. We'll describe get products. We're going to have a category in order to do it. So we're going to use our seed functionality that we have up here. Let's do it before each. And we're going to pass in a done here. And we'll put in our foo ID because we're going to have to use this. And so we'll go over here and and as we do this, this is actually going to allow us to test out our create product as well. So when we go over here, we're going to say db seed function result. We know that that first one is going to be our foo ID. And what are we going to end up doing next here? So we're going to want to do put a done here, of course. And let's just see, if we want to end up testing out our products, we want to be able to insert a product. So let's go over here and we'll say that instead of calling done immediately, let's return db create product. And here we're going to need our foo ID, and we're going to pass in a value for our product. This doesn't exist yet, but in fact, when we end up getting down here, we're going to have at least an ID for our new product. We don't really have to necessarily use it here. But let's go over here and we'll just put our done here. So we'll assume before we end up running this test, we've seeded our data, we've added this product. Again, this is all done with promises, and now we'll do an it. Turns products for category. And so here, we'll specify db get products by ID. And this is going to be our foo ID. And we expect could write two expectations here. What do we expect? We expect products dot length equal 1. And we'll also say that we expect products 0 dot name to equal quug. And of course, this is asynchronous, so it's up to us to supply the done. So first thing that's going to happen when we go to run this, it's going to specify you don't have a get products by ID. Would also have expected it to say that we don't have a create product. And we'll take a look at that. Sorry about that. I actually realized I was doing something incorrectly here. Let me uncomment this. I was trying to figure out why I wasn't running into an error here. And the reason was I was actually just putting a callback here. I don't really want to put a callback in. I want to do what I did before, which is to get my result. And let's move this stuff up here So foo is going to be result 0. And here I'm going to go and I'm going to create the product. Neither one of those things exist. And once I get down here, so what I expect to have happen is I should get an error that specifies that create product doesn't exist. Let's just make sure that that's the case. Unexpected token. That looks a little bit better. Okay. Okay, so db create product is not a function. So let's actually first fix that. So we'll go over here back to our db, and what is create product going to look like? It's going to look a lot like create category, right? This is going to get an ID and a name. The ID is going to be the category ID. Again, we could leverage everything we've done up to this point. Return query, insert into products, category ID, name, values are going to be $1, $2. That's the end of my query string. My parameters are going to be ID and name. And in fact, if that ends up getting inserted, right, I should end up having a product. What probably makes a bit more sense to do is also, since I'm inserting a product, say returning ID. And if we end up going over here, we'll put it in function. Here again, we've got our happy path. The query ended up running. And here we're just going to return our result 0 ID, just in case we wanted to do something with that ID of the product that got inserted. Let's see. db create product is not a function, so this done a few times before. Go up here, create product. Cannot read property ID of undefined. So let's just see what's happening here. Create product. Insert into products, category ID, name. Let's just see where this error is coming from. Line 46. Result.rows. Right, same as I have up here. Or same as I have here, I should say. And we get another error, cannot get products by ID, but that's going to be a pretty easy one to fix. So when we want to get products by ID, we're going to just pass in an ID. And we'll go over here and we'll say return query. Select star from products, where category ID equals $1, and this is going to be our ID. And we'll put a then here, and this is going to be our result. And we're going to return our result dot rows. Right, that's what will end up getting returned from our promise, from our resolved promise. And again, get products by ID. I need to put that here. Also, as you end up seeing our public interface getting pretty big here, you might want to think about separating this out, although we're not going to do that because we're going to end up using SQLize for our models, which is going to do some of that for us. Let's just take a look. Expect. So a little typo here. And let's see if we can pass. And that ends up passing. So now we've got the ability to get products. We've actually tested out indirectly the ability to create a product. One thing we might want to do here is to actually see that we can delete a product as well. So let's go over here. I'm going to get a little bit lazy, and I'm going to say that I wanted to see if I could delete a product. And my expectation here is that if I was successful in deleting a product, that this is going to be 0. Of course, it's not going to be the case. So I expected 1 to be 0. And what I'm going to do here is, in order to see if I can get this to work, so I've created my product. To see if I've got a product ID here. Console.log product ID. This should be the ID of the product I want to delete. So I could see I've got an ID up here of 11, and I'm going to use that by, again, I avoid this whole ability of having these nested callbacks within other callbacks. It would be tricky to write this code without that. So in here, I'm going to say return db delete product, and all we need is the ID, and we're going to wait for this to get resolved until we're done up here. Then once we get in here, we'll call done. Again, we'll get the error that this method delete product doesn't exist. Go back here. You can sort of see from our delete category how this is going to work. This is actually a real simple one to copy, and this is going to be delete product. We're going to pass the ID of the product. Delete from products where ID is equal to this, in which case we've added a product. Now we've taken away that product. Let's not make the mistake that I made before. And now when we run this, all of our tests should end up passing. And this really, even though we didn't end up, there were some things that we didn't end up testing out, we did indirectly test them out. The idea that we can create a product, we actually tested out in 2 spots, in get products and delete product. And the same thing with really delete category as well. So you could see what our public interface is here. You could see that, you know, all of these methods are asynchronous. All of these methods, instead of them taking callbacks, they're returning a promise. So anyone that ends up using these methods is going to have to, since they're promises, is going to have to end up calling then on them. And you know, once we end up having these methods set up, then we could go and we could start focusing on how we could end up creating our routes. And in terms of our routes, once we have our model classes pretty nailed down, our routes should be pretty easy to set up, because you know, it's just a question of setting up the routes and making the calls to our queries to basically populate our data that we're going to end up using with our template engine. So that's the thing that we'll end up doing next. We'll end up doing that with SuperTest.